Our preaching text today is from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 17, verses 1 to 9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Good morning, church.
Good morning.
I mentioned earlier, today we celebrate the feast of the Transfiguration. The only time Jesus allowed his divinity to shine through his humanity. According to Matthew's Gospel, it was a mere 6 days before the Transfiguration that Jesus first tells his disciples about his coming suffering and death. And we know some of the disciples, particularly Peter, tried to dissuade Jesus from what was coming. And can we imagine, church, the turmoil that would be swirling within the disciples' souls? The Transfiguration needs to be understood and placed at this time of crisis in the life of Jesus and his first disciples. By this time, Jesus was aware that he'd already been rejected as Messiah by many of the people, especially those holding power. He now had to face the coming absolute rejection of crucifixion. And how does Jesus face what was coming? He faces it with prayer. He takes his closest 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, and goes up a high mountain with them to pray. Jesus is transfigured. His divinity is seen as a light shining from within. Moses and Elijah appear and converse with Jesus. Peter is uncertain what to say. So he babbles some foolishness about building monuments. Peter is like many of us when we encounter something astonishing. We seek to encircle the astonishing with words. Peter is like those of us who try to submerge mystery under an avalanche of words, as if words alone might make mystery comprehensible. I'm reminded here of the people I've encountered in my travels who are so intent on videotaping everything that any true encounter with a place is unavailable to them. Words cannot break open mystery. Only silence can open us to what is beyond words. But Peter did not know this yet. Soon after Peter finishes his babbling, the mountain is covered with a bright cloud. Now, sisters and brothers, it's certainly unnerving to find oneself in the middle of a cloud. In a cloud, we become disoriented. In a cloud, we feel isolated and cut off from our normal existence. Is this not so? I'm sure most of us have had the experience of being in a cloud, even if that cloud was the fog that so often creeps into our city on little cat feet, as Carl Sandburg so famously stated. Many times I found myself in a cloud, usually when flying. I've never liked being in a cloud. I remember one time I was flying in a small plane from Shreveport, Louisiana to Dallas, Texas. I was sitting next to a woman who was flying for the first time. We entered a cloud as we took off, and we never left the cloud until about 10 seconds before we landed. We spent our flight time bouncing around in the cloud. It was very unnerving. The woman vowed that her first flight would be her last flight. When I'm flying through a cloud in a plane, I'll typically stare out the window. I don't really know what I'm looking for outside the window, but I find it hard to relax in my seat while in a cloud. I keep waiting for the plane to pull out of the cloud. I keep wondering how the pilots can see if I can't. And yes, I know about radar and all the technology that keeps planes from crashing into each other. But there's something visceral, something elemental, something irrational within me that just doesn't like being caught in a cloud. I remember last year when my beloved Beth and I were on the magical island of Maui. We were driving up the 10,000-foot high volcano Haleakala when we found ourselves in a cloud. There are many hairpin turns on the drive up, so we were both happy when we broke through the clouds and found ourselves back in the sunshine. It was an amazing and eerie feeling, however, being on top of the mountain and looking down to see only clouds beneath us. Now, the point of this preaching about clouds is that I can very much sympathize with Peter, James, and John when they become terrified in the cloud, and especially upon hearing the voice of God. It's easy to see how one might be frightened at such an encounter. In the cloud, God speaks for the second and final time in Matthew's Gospel. In God's words, "This is my Son, my beloved, with him I am well pleased. Listen to him." These are basically the same words God speaks over Jesus when he is baptized in the Jordan. Sisters and brothers, we know that God is well pleased with Jesus. We know that God loves Jesus. But for whom were these words spoken? For Peter, James, and John? In one sense, the affirmation of God was to help the disciples, but it was also meant to help Jesus in facing what he was preparing to face. Even though Jesus was and is divine, he was and is also human. And church, Jesus was not God play acting. Jesus was not God pretending to be a human person. Jesus was fully human as anyone who ever lived. To deny the full humanity of Jesus would cast us away from the core of our Christian faith. And because Jesus was fully human, he suffered the uncertainties and doubts that assail every human soul. And yes, Jesus was also divine, and we must never forget his divinity. But in the past, we Christians have often so emphasized Christ's divinity that we fail to comprehend his humanity. Jesus, in his full humanity, needed God's encouragement as every human needs God's encouragement. Life is hard for almost everyone. And Jesus' life was harder than most anyone else's. I'm certain his rejection by the people he came to save weighed heavy upon his heart and heavy upon his soul. I believe this is what underlies the Transfiguration. In the bright cloud, God once again pours abundant love into the heart of the Son of God. We will hear no further words from God in the Gospel of Matthew. But after the divine encouragement of the Transfiguration, Jesus is ready for what awaits him in Jerusalem. So this morning, church, let's place ourselves with Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration. Let's together feel the fear overtaking us in the bright cloud as we hear the commanding voice of God. In that moment, on hearing the voice of God, each of us must give up a cherished secret that we keep hidden. When I hear the voice of God, when I encounter the cloud of God's awesome presence, then I must drop the illusion that I am God. I must cast aside all false notions of my own divinity. In the cloud, brothers and sisters, in our encounter with the true God, we must cast aside all arrogant aspirations to divinity. In the cloud, I must humbly embrace my own humanity, my own reality as a creature, as someone who was made by my Maker. In the cloud, I must fully and finally admit that I did not create myself. In the cloud, I must declare that I am not self-made. Indeed, I am far from being self-made. In the cloud, I must admit that God is God, and I am not. The cloud that surrounds God's presence has a name. In Hebrew, it is spoken of as the Shekinah, the feminine cloud that shields God's presence from sight. We must always accept, church, that God cannot be completely known by us here on earth. Our minds cannot grasp the essential mystery that is God's true nature. We can never possess God. God lives beyond our imaginations. And in the cloud we know this. Listen please to this warning from Richard Rohr in The Naked Now learning to see as the mystics see. Many of us, including clergy, want to have our certain conclusions without any prayer, honest study, suffering, waiting, or inner journey. We just want to think our way to God and be certain every step of the way while still calling it faith. But sisters and brothers, faith is not some sort of magical flashlight. Faith is our willingness to not know, to accept being in the dark, to allow ourselves to be in the confusion and uncertainty of the bright cloud. Faith is not easy. Faith often demands we give up our previous ideas about who God is and how God acts in our lives and in our world. Faith requires us to take up residence, to make a home for ourselves in the cloud, in our uncertainty. It's similar to what the eminent astrophysicist Sir Arthur Eddington famously stated about the universe decades ago. He wrote, "The universe is not only stranger than we imagined, but stranger than we can imagine." And if the universe is beyond our imaginations, then God must be infinitely more so. Brothers and sisters, it is not easy to encounter God. We must let go of our images of God and allow God to be who God is. In a true sense, if we are to embrace God, we must embrace the unknowable. In the cloud, we begin to understand this paradox. In the cloud, we understand that conversion can never be a one-time moment. We see how conversion is a gradual transformation. As the prolific author on spirituality, John Curvin, notes, we carry with us images of Moses and Sinai's burning bush, of Paul thrown from his horse on the road to Damascus. But flash is not to the point. It has, in fact, nothing to do with the experience of spiritual transformation. It never has. The norm is and always has been the ordinary, the everyday, and the commonplace. Moments when God's still small voice gets heard without ceremony, fanfare, or Klieg lights, but with no less effect on our life. Transforming moments are hardly ever dramatic. They are certainly almost always the end product of a long, slow, often exasperating process that is frustratingly wedded to the commonplace. And being in the cloud, church, helps us understand this important truth. In the latter part of the 14th century in England, an anonymous monk wrote a classic treatise on the spiritual life known as The Cloud of Unknowing. In this classic work, we are taught that while we can never imagine God, we can still love God. And the journey we undertake is to love God even when we are caught in the cloud, even when we are uncertain which way to go. The journey to God is not about what we think about God. Our journey to God is not about what we believe about God. Our journey to God, sisters and brothers, is a journey of love and love alone. Brothers and sisters, in the cloud, we cannot see our way. In the cloud, our minds get confused. In the cloud, we are disoriented. But in the cloud, we can still see with our hearts. In the cloud, we can let our love for God lead us boldly forward. In the cloud, we can allow our desire for union with God, our desire for communion with our Maker, to pull us into God's abiding presence. In the cloud, if we listen with our hearts, we'll hear God assure each of us that we are, each of us, beloved, and that God is well pleased with each and every one of us. And then, church, then we will have the courage we need to live our lives with the fullness of faith, a faith that can never be taken from us. Then we will have the courage we need to become what God created us to become. Then we will have the courage we need to live our lives immersed in the mystery of God. Then we will have the courage we need to live without fear in the bright cloud of God's presence, the bright cloud of God's unrelenting closeness, the bright cloud of God's ever-shining, ever-luminous love. Amen.